Thanks for coming. My name is Jack Butler. I'm the founder of the Hillsdale Gadfly Group. This is our second lecture, our third event. And today, Dr. West is going to be speaking on the veil of ignorance and the political philosophy of John Rawls. I don't want to steal too much from his lecture, but John Rawls is probably one of the most important liberal political philosophers of the modern era. So it's very important that we know about him and what he believes. So that's why Dr. West is here. So I know that none of you are here to listen to me talk, so here's Dr. West.
Thank you. So, my understanding is that I'm supposed to defend Rawls. So I'll do that. And I'm going to then expect you to explain why Rawls is wrong. And I'll see if you can do that. So, and I think that the reason why you're going to perhaps have more trouble than you think is because conservatives today really buy into a lot of what Rawls is saying. You probably have heard of Ted Cruz in the U.S. Senate. He's famous for his statement, which he repeats in multiple lectures. Quote, "We must view everything through a Rawlsian lens, how it impacts those at the bottom," unquote. He said that in January to a National Review gathering. He said it here at the college at commencement in May. And he repeats it in speech after speech. I read this particular version of the quote, the National Review version, on the Powerline blog, comment by Steve Hayward. And Hayward's comment was, "While it is sensible to reflect policy through the prism of how it affects the least among us, parenthesis, good politics and good morals, end parenthesis, it is a mistake for conservatives to offer public validation for Rawls, whose thesis is the original text for the redistributive left." So in other words, what Steve Hayward is saying is he's okay with viewing everything through the Rawlsian lens, how it impacts those at the bottom. He's just saying, don't mention the name Rawls. Other than that, it's great. So here's a conservative criticizing another conservative for using Rawls, saying it's fine to think the way Rawls thinks, but just don't use his name. So what does the Rawlsian lens lead to? Let me give you a practical example. During the famous non-filibuster that Rawls conducted recently in the Senate, he talked frequently in the talk, he mentioned the single mom working in the diner struggling to feed her kids, who has just been told she has to take a cut in hours due to Obamacare. That's a quote. So I looked this up on the internet, and I found an angry feminist who quoted this line and said, "Ted Cruz makes it sound like this single mom is just barely hanging in there, and that Obamacare is going to be the straw to break the camel's back." So then this woman goes into, this feminist points out, well, the median wage for employees in food preparation is $9 an hour. That means that her wages are probably so low she's eligible for Medicaid, which is being expanded under Obamacare to cover people who earn up to 133% of the poverty level. So she qualifies for full medical for free. So in other words, let's look at the Rawlsian lens that Senator Cruz says to bring to bear here. This woman benefits from Obamacare if you use the Rawlsian lens. He said, oh no, she's harmed by Obamacare because she's going to have her hours cut because because the restaurant will not want to keep her at full time if she's going to have to be given health insurance by the restaurant. But the point is, this woman is making, correctly on the internet, is no, she doesn't need to go to the exchanges or go to have health insurance through her work because she's poor. And Obama's going to pay for everybody's health care through Medicare, through the expansion of Medicaid, which is what she's getting. So that's one way to look at it. So, but let's try to understand. What I want to say something about here is how does Rawls get to this conclusion? Rawls has this argument that it's well known, but it's well enough known, but at the same time, not everybody knows it. So I'll just go through it. He himself starts off his book, A Theory of Justice, by running through the basic argument. And he mentions 4 points. First, he says that justice is defined by Rawls as the principles that free and rational persons who are concerned to further their own interests would accept in an initial position of equality. So in other words, if you start off from equal position of equality, everyone would choose these principles of justice if they were being rational. And that would advance their own interests. So there's nothing here in Rawls about any idealism or, we need to do this because we care about the poor. Oh no, it's all about your own self-interest. Second point is that in order to understand what these principles of justice are and why people would choose them, you have to imagine an original position in which the facts about your own situation are concealed behind a veil of ignorance, which is where this title of the talk comes from. So, in other words, picture yourself in a position, this is totally hypothetical, not real world at all. He's saying this is just a thought experiment. Picture yourself in a situation where you don't know whether you're a man or a woman, you don't know what you think is important in life, you have no idea what sort of a background you're coming from, whether you're in a family that's wealthy or non-wealthy, whether you're brainy or really dumb. The point is, all you know is that there's this human condition that you're in. And what he says, what you're allowed to know is you're allowed to know facts about human psychology and facts about how society works and facts about how economics works. So you can know something about the way human beings interact together. You just can't know whether you yourself are going to be in the 1% or the 99%. So the thought experiment is then, since you don't know your situation, that's concealed behind this veil of ignorance, what would you choose? What principles of organizing society would you choose? That's the whole argument of Rawls. Now then he goes into explanations and the difficulties, challenges. But that's the basic idea. And his argument is what we would choose are these 2 principles of equality in basic rights and duties, and inequality would be justified only if it helps the least fortunate among us. That's the Rawlsian lens that Senator Cruz talks about. And then finally, so that's the third point. The fourth point is that is a moral argument that Rawls keeps coming back to. He says we have to understand that no one deserves anything that makes them different from other people. So you have to realize that if you think that somehow or other, because you're smart, you deserve to be smart, that's ridiculous, Rawls argues. You can't possibly think that. You didn't create your brains. Somebody else did. God did. Nature did. You didn't build that. That's built by something other than you. So whether you're wealthy, whether you're brainy, whether you have white privilege, whatever it might be, you didn't do that. Something else happened that made you that way. And so there's no moral. So the point is that therefore, that's why he's saying if there's any inequality in society, it's not deserved. It only gets justified insofar as it serves those who are the least advantaged. Now, if we go to the so let's go back to what it is that we supposedly have equally. He says the thing that everybody cares about, he calls them the primary goods. The thing that is, when he says that we choose to have equal rights and equal goods at the beginning, he means the primary goods. Because you can't have, for example, if you think that, for example, being a great scientist is something that would be good for you, that's unique to you. What he's saying is think about the kinds of goods that every human being is going to benefit from, however smart or dumb, however wealthy or poor. And he says that list includes things like life, liberty, property, except personal, he says, except that's limited to personal property. You don't get to amass property. That's not a primary good, just the personal property you need. And he adds this one little extra thing, and that is the primary good of self-respect has a central place. And I want to quote a passage where he, later in the book, where he's talking about self-respect. He says, a sense of their own worth is necessary if they, that is, if people are to pursue their conception of the good with zest and to delight in its fulfillment. A sense of your own worth. So in other words, let's say you're in the original position. What am I going to do with my life? I don't know. I'll only find that out after the veil of ignorance gets lifted. I have to picture myself as having no idea what my life plan might be, but knowing that I'm going to have a life plan. And one of the things that's necessary for any successful life plan, he's saying, is self-respect. And then he adds this really important phrase. He says, our self-respect normally depends upon the respect of others. Unless we feel that our endeavors are honored by others, it is difficult, if not impossible, for us to maintain the conviction that our ends are worth advancing. So you have to feel good about yourself, and the only way that can happen, he's saying, is if other people respect you. So what you have to remember now, what does this mean? This means that no matter what life plan you may choose for yourself, you're behind this veil of ignorance. You're saying, whatever it is I'm about to choose, other people need to respect it. Otherwise, it's going to be really bad for me and I'm not going to be happy. I'm not going to be able to pursue my life plan with zest and delight. So, what if your life plan is to be a deadbeat? What if your life plan is to be a gay guy, a lesbian? Equal respect is the fundamental law here. So this is absolutely crucial to his theory. Because at first it kind of sounds a little bit like the founders or John Locke, life, liberty, and property, and primary goods. But he adds this self-respect thing, and that's all about how every way of life has to be equally respected. Now let me just very briefly compare this to the older deeds, so the few that you find in the founders. Founders were all for toleration, but toleration meant you get to have your religion, your way of life. Other people are allowed to criticize it, but they can't attack you for it. They can't rob you for it. They can't beat you up for it. So you don't get the right of equal respect, self-respect, in the founders' view. That's Rawls is saying that was one of the great defects of the earlier traditions, what he's saying. That we didn't have this right of self-respect, which also entails a right to be respected by others. Now, I'm going to say here, how many conservatives are going to disagree with that point? How many conservatives are going to go back to Locke or go back to the founding and say, it's perfectly okay to walk around and say, I think gays are really bad people. They ought to just shut up and stay in the closet. I really think it's terrible for people to be promoting gay rights in school. Right? Rawls is saying, you have just violated the fundamental primary right. Or you have just taken away a primary good. He doesn't talk about this in terms of rights. He talks about it in terms of primary good. You've taken away a primary good from someone who happens to have chosen a life path that's different from yours. What if a person decides, I really don't like working very much. I think I'll just be a single mom and have a child. Can you imagine any conservative in the Congress talking about that single mom waitress that that Ted Cruz brought up and say, you know, what's wrong with that woman? Why was she having a kid out of wedlock in the first place? She should have gotten married. And why did she dump her husband? Or why did he dump her? There's something wrong with society where people are allowed to get married, have kids, and then dump each other, or have kids without getting married. That's totally judgmental. Rawls is saying you can't have a society like that. No one in this original position would choose to live in a world in which, when they suddenly realize, gosh, I'm gay, they're opening themselves up to being disparaged, mistreated, talked about in that way by other people. How many conservatives really would disagree with Rawls on this point? I don't think there are very many. I think Rawls' argument is pretty powerful. Okay, so let's talk about going back to that's the primary goods. Let's talk about the inequality part of Rawls' argument. He says that if certain inequalities of wealth and organizational powers would make everyone better off in this hypothetical starting position, then they accord with the general conception of justice. So, inequalities of wealth and organizational powers is okay if it fits the general conception of justice, meaning as long as it serves the least among us. So what would that mean? Who would be that? Can you guys get what this is about? Who are the people who are these unequal people who get all these privileges, but it's okay in Rawls' system?
Everyone in the government.
Everybody in the government. Insofar as government is serving the poor, the downtrodden, the disabled, the disadvantaged, and so on. Old people, women, all the groups that are excluded. Now, if the government is in the business of being in bed with capitalists and just being crony capitalists, no, then it becomes unjust. Anybody else besides people in government?
What was the question?
No, Rawls is saying inequality is okay as long as it serves the disadvantaged. So who else would be the position of serving the disadvantaged, let's say?
By serving the disadvantaged, though, wouldn't you be disadvantaging the advantaged? Meaning, like those that have the advantage, by serving the disadvantaged, wouldn't you be giving the upper people a disadvantage?
Well, he's saying that
That's okay. That's okay.
if you're unequal, let's say you're smart and you're making a lot of money. That's okay if you're serving those who are below you. It's not okay if you're just taking care of your family and being generous to your friends. But so in other words, there has to be, what do we call it? The notion of giving back to the community, giving back. So somehow or other the community gave me, or somebody gave me, God, nature, somebody gave me my brains in my fortunate circumstance. So we have this expression, giving back, when you're really successful in life. You need to give back. That's what Rawls is saying, is this idea of giving back. That's the fundamental thing that justifies inequality. And now, of course, any other person who's unequal, like the Koch brothers, for example, who are interested in, mining, pumping oil and gas and stuff, they don't deserve their inequality. That's bad. They need to have their extra income taken away. Because they're not serving anybody except themselves, according to Rawls. So in addition to government officials, we heard about that, I would add college professors would be another important group of people who are unequal, who have cushy jobs that are paid well, especially in the Ivy League, and where they're justified because they're in the business of serving the disadvantaged. Not in the direct classroom, because of course everybody in their class is really smart, but in the sense of writing books like Rawls' Theory of Justice. They're writing the books, they are the ideologues on behalf of the poor, the downtrodden, the disadvantaged, the excluded. And the more you as a professor, or as an intellectual, so let's say journalist, the more you're doing, pushing that agenda of the downtrodden, the more justified your inequality is. So if you're being paid, a couple of $1 million a year to be on the Today Show or giving the evening news on CBS, that's good, though, because remember, you're putting that message out there all about how government and everybody needs to be in the service of those people who are disadvantaged. So this is the neat thing about this whole system, is it justifies all these important elements of contemporary liberalism. And I think very logically, too. I think powerfully. You got a comment?
Yeah, it's just interesting, like, what is the point that defines when someone becomes unequal?
Well, you just have to look and see. I mean, if there's somebody who's above the average of what that society is in terms of income, wealth, privilege, prestige. I mean, Rawls would say, yeah, you can get into long debates about how you quantify it, but the basic idea behind this theory of justice is what he's talking about. Implementation, that might be difficult, but this is the goal to aim at. It's the ideal society that it would be the thing that it's what he's saying makes sense out of the whole thing. The difference, so let's see. So since inequalities of birth and natural endowments are undeserved, these inequalities have to be compensated for. And that might mean, for example, he says, to provide genuine equality of opportunity, society must give more attention to those with fewer native assets and to those born into the less favorable social positions. So in other words, equal rights in the founder's sense is unjust, because that means you're treating the poor and the wealthy according to the same standard. Rawls's point, which is again very powerful, is that would be unjust. The poor are the ones who need help. So that's why in our society we have all kinds of help for them. We have Medicaid, we have Medicare, we have Social Security, we have Social Security Disability, we have all these programs, Section 8 housing, all of these programs that are about people who are being given more resources because they are disadvantaged. The naturally advantaged are to gain, perhaps in some cases they are to have extra, only to cover the cost of training and education and to use their endowments in ways that help the less fortunate as well. Now Rawls is not a socialist. He doesn't say we should throw out free markets. He says we need free markets. But it's free markets in this framework of redistribution. That's what he's talking about. Basically talking about the way Western societies are governed in Europe and America, where you have a market system highly regulated with very substantial redistribution of resources. He argues in favor that, so he says, one of the things that's good about this way of thinking about justice is it also answers our feeling that justice ought to include the idea not only of liberty and equality, but also of fraternity. Fraternity means brotherhood. And he's saying, isn't this how families operate? Families don't talk about treating everybody equally in the sense of you get the exact same amount of income. Every child in the family gets what's appropriate to him at that age based on his abilities and what the parents judge is good for him. Isn't that a better principle to organize society by? Rawls says. That's what justice means. So the idea of justice in the way he's talking about it also then answers to what we feel is the meaning of fraternity. Now, one word on how this choice gets made. Going back to the original position, you're behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know who you are, what you desire, what your wants are. He says that there's a rule of choice that governs how you make your choices in that situation when you don't know your standing. And he calls it the maximin rule. The maximin. Maximizing the minimum. And he abbreviates that, calling it maximin. What that means is that you're going to be thinking about, what if I'm the minimum? What if I'm in the least advantaged situation? That means I need to think about what would be good for me if that's the way I am. You're not going to be thinking, gosh, I might be really brainy and therefore I don't want any redistribution of resources. You can't. He's saying, no one would think that way who's thinking rationally in this original position behind the veil. You would be thinking of it in terms of the Maximin rule, which tells us to rank alternatives by their worst possible outcomes. So let's say suddenly the veil of ignorance is lifted, you realize you're the single mom who's a waitress. You need help. You can't make it on your own. You need Medicaid, you need whatever it might be. You need special help for your child, you need access to special government programs for women. You're going to be thinking of yourself that way. And you should. He's saying that's how you should. That's how the human mind works. He's saying that the human beings are, if they don't know whether they're advantaged, they will look at themselves. They look at the choice in terms of this ranking alternatives by their worst possible outcome. That's the basic line of argument. Now, there are lots of things that can be said to raise doubts about this. So I want to see what people here think about that. And I'll try to defend it. Go ahead.
To quote Aesop, the hares harangued the assembly, stating that all should be equal. The lions reply to them the words, "Your words, O hares, are good, but where are your claws and teeth such as we have?" That is to say, inequality is its own justification. That is, there are things equal about people that ought to be kept equal, namely the rights themselves, and then there are actual differences that, as justified by the inequalities themselves, ought to be kept unequal. If we were to put both the hares and lions behind a veil of ignorance and then consider them from that perspective, we'd have the hares eating lions in no time. Which would be contrary to
what he's saying is the hare, whether you were a hare or a lion, you wouldn't know. And you'd be afraid you'd find out you were a hare. Therefore, you would create rules to put the lions under restraint. That's justice.
But it's contrary to the natural order.
Oh no, he's saying it is contrary to the natural order in the sense of the strong tend to dominate the weak. The whole point of this argument is not what would happen when people have their eyes open, but rather what ought to happen if they don't know their own personal situation. So you need a society that's going to restrain the lions. And by the way, the founding fathers would agree with that point too. I mean, founders and Rawls would agree. Lions and hares, yeah, that's the state of nature. That's bad. We need to get out of that. That's why we need justice created by, established and defended by law. Now, the founders and Rawls defend justice differently, but they're all sure that the lions need to be kept under control. Right, so, except, go ahead.
Quote Frederick Bastiat, "I like your life and liberty, or paraphrase one, I like your life and liberty, but that's destroyed by fraternity." Basically, how do you maintain fraternity through the state? And that would be via coercion, at whose expense type of argument.
Yes,
So,
that's Rawls. Now, yeah.
yeah.
And so Rawls is saying, okay, so what's wrong with that? So how would you
In
respond?
maintaining so-called fraternity, you're destroying liberty.
Okay. What kind of liberty is being destroyed exactly?
The freedom to pursue your happiness.
By doing what?
Well,
Making money?
no. Possibly.
See, what Rawls is saying is, you can pursue any kind of happiness you want to, but if it means if you get more money and more prestige, then we're going to draw the line.
And why would you draw the line there if you're not supposed to? If you're supposed to respect everyone equally.
Well, you're supposed to. No, he doesn't. Yeah, he says everyone's way of life is to be respected equally. Everyone's choice for his way of life. But that's the second. That's part of the. What he's saying is the first principle that you're going to choose to institute justice is equality in the primary goods,
Yes.
which would include equal respect, equal access to property, equal access to liberty, too. Equal access to liberty, to the same degree others have it. See, as long as you're not going to try to acquire more property than others, he's going to say that deserves equal respect. If you say, no, my way of life requires more property than others, no, that would mean that our idea of justice is going to
As
rule
viewing
that out.
property as a purely stagnant object,
Yes.
why can't property be expanded by the market process?
Well, he would probably say, yes, it can be, right? But once it's expanded, then there has to be the redistribution. I mean, it goes back to, that's why I emphasize, it goes back to the idea that you don't deserve the talents that you
So
have.
what incentive does the individual have to use those talents at all to pursue the better interests of society as a whole?
Yeah. The incentive would be, there will be a market system. The government will allow you to acquire some money. There will be, inequality will be permitted to the extent that it serves the common good. Now, the way Rawls talks about the common good, it doesn't seem to think that the Koch brothers are contributing to the common good by creating more gas and oil. But his way of thinking is actually open to that possibility. There would be some place for market freedom, some place for some inequality in the market, as long as it doesn't get too great,
I'm saying the social.
as long as there's enough to maintain the incentive to work.
And I'm
using your
saying the
example.
social safety net in the long term would disassemble that prosperity that comes with that.
Well, that's an empirical question, right? Because
Yeah.
the Swedes are going to say, look at us, we've done this for a long time,
They had to make major fiscal austerity changes 10 years ago to do that.
Yes. And that's what would have to happen. You'd have to, yes. The argument, that's what the argument is, right? So the argument is that
What's the best way to do that?
you have to, you get into the question of how do you make this work? How do you make sure there's enough incentive for people to actually want to work? The overall plan, though, the overall framework is in terms of the least advantaged benefiting. And as long as that's the way it's set up, then you can have this combination of markets,
Yeah.
partial market freedom with redistribution.
That would also bring in a moral argument of the non-aggression principle, but that's a different thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I kind of have a lead-in thing and then my question. Would he be saying all this stuff about redistribution and the veil of ignorance and kind of living in fear that you're the hare is not the line because he kind of believes in Malthusian lack, or is it just because he's trying to do what's right? So is there is the pie only so big and we have to make sure it's sliced up properly, or is it because the pie might expand and contract, but we have to do what's most right? From what sense is he saying that we need to redistribute and help people who are...
It's not a question of what's right at first. When you're in the original position, it's not about what's right, it's in what's in my interest.
Okay.
That's why he's saying people would choose this way of organizing society. It's in my interest because I might turn out to be the guy who's really dumb and lazy, or have bad luck and bad family. And so if that's your way of viewing it, then you will end up with with a choice of this type.
Okay, so then if you're under that veil of ignorance and what is best for you and in that completely egalitarian state that you're all in,
Yeah.
so how do you have society that's truly just and truly codified and having a law because it's just what you think is just at that time? How is it actual law that's based in something, founded in something other than what you think is just under that veil of ignorance, I should say? What's it actually founded in other than I think this because I'm in this situation?
That is what it's founded in. He's saying a rational person in that original position behind the veil of ignorance will choose this.
So what about...
And that creates justice. There's no natural law or natural right.
So there's no objective justice, there's no natural law.
Well, he thinks it's objective because he says this will always happen. He's saying you put people in this situation, if they're rational, if they know human nature, if they know the relevant facts, they will always choose this. And so it is a kind of universal in the sense people will always make that choice because that's what's ultimately in their interest as possibly someone who's very disadvantaged.
So that's saying there's universality of human nature, but not necessarily of law and right and wrong.
Well, it is universal in the sense of that this is, well, people will keep choosing it. This is right. This book is called A Theory of Justice. He's saying this, you want to know what justice is, read my book. This is what it's really all about. All those people in the past who wrote about justice, they didn't know what they were talking about. Because they allowed too much of a role for knowing for a particular version of a good life. I mean, really what his critique of the previous tradition comes down to is everybody in the past always had some notion of a good life. What was the good life? He said, we need to get away from that. We need to think about what would we choose if we didn't even know what our own choice for the good life would be. If we only chose the means to whatever way of life we might end up with.
So in a sense, this requires our ignorance, us to be in a state, or
In the thought experiment, you have to be partially ignorant. You have to be ignorant to your own personal situation. Yeah, that's exactly right. Go ahead.
Being like, let's say that you end up as a hare per se, like you are the lower end, the unfortunate. Isn't this system designed to keep you there?
Well, he would say, what he does say actually is, no, this system is all about taking people who are unfortunate and giving them the best possible opportunity they have of becoming the most they can. Putting them in a position where they can realize their life plan no less than somebody born to a wealthy family who has high intelligence. Now, of course, he recognizes that's only so much you can do for a situation like that. But that's in an ideal society. And by the way, one of the things that I think that makes Rawls different from many other liberals is he doesn't in any way pretend that all human beings are the same and all equal in terms of talents. He's very clear over and over again, absolutely not. People are very unequal. But he's saying that's why you have to organize things in this way, to make sure that the ones who aren't as talented or as gifted or whatever have every opportunity they can that we can bring them. To live their way of life, the choice that they have. So again, let me mention another contrast. So if you contrast this view with that of the progressive era of the early 20th century, so people like Charles Merriam, Woodrow Wilson, Charles Goodenow, Theodore Roosevelt, that crowd. Those people were saying that there is a right way of life that everyone should lead. And that is a life in which you cultivate your talents to the fullest, and then at the peak of it, you then enter into service to others to enable them to cultivate theirs. In other words, there's really one best way of life that everyone ought to achieve as far as they're able to approximate it, according to the early 20th century progressives. And then Rawls is saying, no, that we need to get away from that. That's judgmental. I mean, let's just put it in a very simple way. The progressives thought it was a good idea for young men and young women to get married and stay married and raise families. Rawls is saying that would be wrong for society to impose some model on people about that sort of thing. People should be able to do whatever they want sexually and equally honored for whatever their choice might be. Thus the single mom waitress thing.
But if you try to eliminate judgment, and I know it's impossible, but wouldn't that basically, wouldn't it be impossible to have any law then? Because if you're trying to, you start off with the right to primary goods,
Yeah.
and that one that he added in there, that self-respect and the respect that everybody has to have. If you choose to make a law, like every time you make a law, you're imagining through this veil of ignorance. Like, is there any law that you actually could make?
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, if you're trying to respect every single way of life, is there any law that would?
Well, think of the way we do it today. So if you say something in public that disparages black people, disparages women, disparages other minorities, disparages gays, you're very likely to be fired from your job. You're going to find that your friends won't talk to you. you're going to find that you may actually be audited by the IRS.
But wouldn't that
That
disrespect?
works.
But wouldn't that disrespect that person's way of life?
Yeah, no, I understand. Yes, the whole point of this whole system is to be judgmental against people who don't go along with the Rawlsian setup. Absolutely.
Okay.
He's very, like most liberals, he doesn't want to talk much about that. That's the nasty side of it.
Yeah, I was gonna say because
Yeah.
there's laws about you can't disparage against things like that, but doesn't that law itself disrespect that person who
Absolutely.
feels the
Yeah. And that's really, I mean, that's a really good point you're bringing up, because that's, I keep hearing around the college, and people keep telling me, the problem with our time is we're relativists. We just believe any way of life is just as good as any other, and, we need to get away from relativism. And Rawls makes it clear, for the reason you just say, this is not relativism at all. He's saying, I know what justice is, and I'm going to shove it down your throat. You come to my class at Harvard, this guy's a Harvard prof, died a few years ago, but, you come to my class at Harvard, we're not going to beat around the bush and pretend there are other views of justice that are just as good. I got the answer. And, as a thought experiment, we'll talk about Nazi Germany or whatever, but I mean, the whole point is that's not going to happen. And, founding fathers, yeah, that was nice, that was in the past. We're done with that. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. Yes?
This isn't a comprehensive to Rawls, but I think something that's really good to push on with him that we haven't really been talking about is the fact that he says in great justice that behind the veil of ignorance, you are going to be neutral with respect to the good. So you don't know what your conception of the good is.
Right.
You just have you just as a human being have certain urges. So there are desirables, but they're not goods.
Well, he calls them primary goods. He's saying you can know what the primary goods are, meaning the goods, things that you would need as means for any particular choice of a way of life. The kind of good that you don't know about is, as you say, what your way of life will be, what your personal goal will be as the highest good.
Right.
But right, okay.
Yeah, and I think I think that Rawls fails to distinguish between something that you want as at the service of your body and sustaining your own life, and what your understanding of the good in the world is.
Yes.
And so I think maybe something to push on is his very mechanism. So not what he comes up with based on his mechanism, but the fact that he's coming up with a mechanism that has already presumed this lack of intelligible good to the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I like to compare the original position to the state of nature. So the founding fathers' state of nature versus the original, because there's some parallels. Because basically both are saying, well, what would people choose if they were free to choose a way of life and they didn't have an existing political order in place? But the founders would say, look, we're not presuming that people are ignorant about their own understanding of what the good is. In fact, it's really important that people know what that is. That's what life's about. So the question is, given that you know what yours and that other people do, is there any basis on which we can find common ground, given the possible disparate goals? And how disparate can they be? One of the points that the founders made is, well, you can have some variation in terms of the pursuit of happiness, but it can't be too radical. So, for example, they thought that it was really important to have the family, meaning a married mother and father with their children, as the core institution of society. And they had a whole set of laws and customs that were meant to support that. That was part of what the way of life of the community was going to be, independently of, let's say, whether you were going to go to college or not, or become a farmer or a banker. But with Rawls, as you say correctly, he's ruling out any ability to think about what you'd actually care about in life. So the thing that's the most important thing in life, you're not supposed to think about. It's a very odd way of making sense out of it. And it seems to me it leads to he sets it up that way so that there will be this non-judgmentalism with regard to ways of life that people like founders, or let's say in the earlier tradition, would have found destructive of the health of any society. So, Jack?
Yes, I agree that we should be going after the philosophical foundation of this. I mean, it's important to understand what the ramifications of this view are, but I think that the thing that bothers me about this view is it's basically a rejection of reality, I guess. Like the point of the thought experiment is to imagine a way things could be that they aren't. I can't really articulate very well why that's wrong, but it just seems odd to me that there is no, in the real world, there is no veil of ignorance. Like, people are unequal. And if we all even if we do throw ourselves, or put this veil of ignorance over ourselves, we're accepting that there's going to be a class of people that gets to peek out from underneath it to set up everything. The rest of us stay beneath it. So we're supposed to accept their judgment on how to set up the society of non-judgment.
No, I think he really means that. He thinks this is what people would choose. Everybody would choose. You don't need to peek from under and, well, I know that I'm going to be special or something. Now, whether it's true, but he's saying that this is what people would choose. He's really saying, people are basically very cautious by nature. They're timid, you might even say. He's fearful. He's got Hobbes' idea that men are by nature fearful. He doesn't have Hobbes' idea that men are by nature proud. Yeah. Hobbes says both. Rawls reduces us to purely fearful, and therefore calculating, what if I'm the really lowest of the low, and how can I organize everything to benefit me? Because that's what this comes down to. I think that's what makes it feel unrealistic to you. Because it's really he's really basically saying there isn't a common good. He's saying the calculation is not with a view to what is good for the society as a whole. It's what's good for the disadvantaged. And that's what we would all choose, all of us, if we were in that situation.
Then it becomes...
Which, I agree with you, is a problem. I don't think that's obviously the case.
To me, it sounds a bit like, I think it's Kant with the categorical imperative, right? You're supposed to imagine moral actions.
No, it's not like Kant at all, because Kant is all about, morality for Kant is doing something that's not necessarily in your interest at all. You're doing it because it's simply freely willed, according to a universal law, independently of your self-interest. Rawls is saying, no, everything comes back to your self-interest in the original position. You would choose this because you would believe it's in your self-interest. It has this, I know he brings Kant up, but it really isn't that much of a parallel.
Part of Kant that I'm trying to bring up, though, is I think it's Kant who says that you should make decisions about morality, assuming or thinking about how it would be if everybody made the same decision in a society. That's the likeness that
he's saying that. He's saying you should do that, but you should do it because it's a moral duty. Whereas Rawls is saying you should do it because it's in your self-interest.
So you should be selfless because you're selfish.
Well, it's not selfless if you're picturing yourself as a bug that might get squashed if you end up in a society where all the tough guys get to dominate. Go ahead.
How can he talk about moral duty when he's basically thinking that every single way of life should...
I'm saying Kant talks about moral duty,
I'm sorry.
not Rawls. Rawls is about self-interest, and this is really what self-interest leads to, he says.
But you said that Rawls, he thinks that, if you're wealthy or if you're poor, either way, you didn't do that. It was, ordained that way. How can you think that there's some kind of ordination if there's... where is he getting his scope for people being ordained in these paths of life if they can be anything? And how... I'm sorry, my words are kind of broken up.
He's saying, look, we're all different. People are going to choose different paths. They're going to go down they're going to have different choices about what they think is the right life for them. He says, that is something we can't judge. That's something we have to just say, We're leaving that open.
But he's at the same time he says that people it's not their fault. Like there's nothing they can do about it. As far as if they're poor or if they're rich.
Well, they can't do anything about it themselves. Now, the society can step in and say, start a Head Start program, give the parents extra income, send him off to have affirmative action so he gets to go to the best colleges and so on. So there are things that can be done socially, politically to make things better. Yeah, you're right. Go ahead.
I think the problem he was striking at was that whole notion that you used an interesting word there, choose. Does that choice entail moral responsibility for your choice? As in it
He's saying that he doesn't want to get into moral responsibility except in terms of violations of what justice is as he sketches it. But the whole point is you're supposed to not be judgmental about...
Okay, so like with socioeconomic mobility, isn't this kind of throwing that out the window? Or showing that...
Well, you get into an empirical question of what's the best way to make that mobility possible. He says all this redistributive stuff is the way to do it.
Okay.
What would you say?
I would say not at all.
You're going to go with markets?
Yeah, I'm going to go along Miesian.
Okay, but let's have on the founders' view on this. Because the founders are going to say is combination of free markets, so the von Mises stuff, plus stable marriages. So the social conservative stuff. I mean, think about it. What is it that people like, say, Jefferson or Hamilton, what is it that they thought would enable the poor to do well in our society? Those two things had to be there both together.
The other thing is... And
that meant that the society, here's the thing, where I don't think conservatives today are going to buy into this. That, the founders' view was the women who are going to go out and have kids without being married, they need to be shamed publicly. They need to be made clear to them that is a shameful thing to do. Her girlfriends need to cut her off. She needs to go off to another town to have her baby. I mean, you have to have a situation where that is considered to be a really shameful thing. Otherwise, you end up with a single mom waitress who then can't take care of her kid. And then you have to have Rawls coming in to give her all these special programs, which means that in the end, because think about the bottom line here. That single mom, her father, the father of that child is out of that child's life. That's the bottom line for the Rawlsian system as it works in practice. And here I'm going to drop my mask of neutrality. Because that means then you're going to set up a system, and by being non-judgmental about people's way of life, it means that you're going to make up a society in which probably a majority of children are deprived of one or both parents during their childhood, some or all of their childhood. That is how our society today is organized. And now, we also have today, on the market side, all kinds of limitations on market entry, all kinds of cronyism, all kinds of ways that the government is screwing everything up all the time by printing money and then stopping printing money, creating booms and busts. All of that's happening too. So that too is a responsibility. So again, these are things that, and then the judgmentalism. What about the person who's the thief? He needs to have.
Well, that's where I think the problem comes
to be
in.
shamed too.
Well, I think that's where the problem comes in. It ignores doing something that aggresses against another person. It's a problem.
Yeah, now he's going to say you need a
think that
criminal
includes-
law, you
and
need
I think that
punishments.
includes the government's redistributive thing as a method of coercion.
Right. But you see, I mean, you can see that the way he's talking about it, the only kind of thing that would be an ambiguity in his system would be, say, something like drug abuse. You know, he might wonder, well, you know, maybe it's really harming these people because it's making it impossible for them to think straight about their situation.
Did he ever write about that?
Do I what?
Did he ever write about that?
Oh, I don't know. I am not a Rawls expert. I'm only interested in Rawls from the point of view of he's the guy who creates the big framework for how liberals think about stuff. And the details, I mean, there are Rawlsians out there by the thousands who definitely are interested in all this. Do you have a comment? Blue?
No.
Go ahead.
It seems that he's established an egalitarianism of ideas paralleling his egalitarianism of people. That is to say, it's almost as though if you don't know behind the veil of ignorance what ideals you'll hold, you'll want to hold the ideals themselves behind a veil of ignorance, which means that, say in a society you have people who believe that 2 and 2 makes 5, and 2 and 2 makes 4, we ought to consider those equal. Now, if they use it in, say, engineering as a principle, those who say 2 and 2 makes 4 will necessarily do far better in that result, and therefore they will become necessarily more prosperous. And
So what he's saying is, too, he's saying, it really is a question for Rawls, should we be judgmental about the people who can't add?
and so,
I mean, that's a problem, because, you know, it's going to make them feel bad. There are some people who are really dumb out there, and who are choosing a way of life that smart people would say, that's really dumb.
and so shouldn't the purpose be more education to the correct as opposed to egalitarianism of ideas to the detriment of the whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's easier if you're proceeding from a pre-Rawlsian point of view. It's easier to make the judgment you're talking about. I mean, I just say in a practical way. Here's one of the things I've noticed the difference. When I was a kid in school, and this was in the pre-Rawls days, it was all extremely no nonsense. There was discipline. There was corporal punishment occasionally for really bad boys out of line. There was all kinds of stuff where everybody was taught basically to the limit of their ability. No one hesitated for 1 minute to put the dumb kids in a dumb class so that they wouldn't hold back the smart ones. That was just how it was done, and nobody thought of there being any moral problem there. Once you get Rawls in place, then all that becomes a matter of agonizing. Is it going to hurt the feelings of the dumb kids if we put them in a separate class? Or is it going to hurt their feelings more if we put them in with a bunch of smart kids? And they'll go back and forth. Well, the smart kids by osmosis might rub off on the dumb ones, so maybe we should have them in there. Or maybe they'll learn better in their own group. But the idea of having clear, strong standards, that's undermined by this whole way of thinking, where you're not allowed to be judgmental against a way of life. Let's have one final question. John, you had one?
Oh, yeah, well, I was wondering about just the basic conception of justice from the very beginning of the thought experiment. It seems like, let me know if I'm wrong, it seems that justice is basically determined to be a calculated self-interest.
Yeah.
Does that sort of, I mean, if we're supposed to be starting at a point where it's like, well, we don't know what justice is, we're going to have to like figure that out through the thought experiment. It seems like we've already brought in a lot of baggage in the very beginning by just ruling out certain conceptions of justice.
Yes.
Where we have to set aside our self-interest. So in a way, haven't we already decided what the boundaries will be for the answer we come to at the very beginning of the thought experiment?
Yes, and in fact, one of Rawls' critics once described him as, yes, you're doing a very good job of describing the trimming inside of the cave of Harvard University intellectuals. In other words, you're describing your own universe, your own mental universe, by defining the original position in this extremely odd way. So, if you want to comment, you're going to have to make it quick.
Just adding on top of that, it sounds like a lot of it also requires, because it says, oh, well, you can understand human psychology and how economics works and society sort of function, but then it requires a certain understanding of how economics works and a certain understanding of human psychology in order to come to these particular things. And so you're already bringing in your own interpretation.
So you're going to have to rule out von Mises, and you're going to have to rule out the Founding Fathers and John Locke.
Yeah,
and
and
all
so
of
you're-
that kind of psychology is out
So
there.
you actually have to bring in already it's all predetermined because of the understanding of human psychology that you bring in the first place.
So it's not an experiment at
Yeah.
all.
All right, John.
It's not a very good feeling.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. All right, thank you,
Enjoy
everyone.
it. Thanks for coming, guys.
Thank you, Dr. Morris.
It's not a
So
problem.
it's actually like get to choose your particular system.